When the doors of the ark finally opened, they didn't open onto a paradise. They opened onto a graveyard. Every city, every face, every voice that had ever spoken, buried under the mud. You know the other version. The dove, the olive leaf, the animals walking into bright green fields. It's comforting, and it's almost entirely wrong. It ignores the terrifying reality of what life after the flood actually was. How 8 people had to restart humanity from absolute zero. The flood was never the hardest part of this story. The silence that came after it was. For more than a year, the ark had been a sealed world. A floating box of wood and pitch, dark and close, filled with the sound of animals and the breathing of 8 frightened people, rising and falling on water that covered everything they had ever known. And then, one day, the motion stopped. The great vessel shuddered and came to rest, grounding against something solid beneath the surface for the first time in longer than any of them could clearly remember. The waters had begun to retreat. The world, somewhere under all that water, was coming back. But coming back is not the same as being restored. Picture the moment the door is finally unsealed. Noah sets his hand against the heavy frame and pushes, and the seal that has held out an entire drowned world for over a year gives way. Light pours in, and with the light comes the air. And the air is the first thing that tells them the truth. It is thick, heavy with the smell of wet earth and silt and rot, the smell of a world that has been underwater and is only now drying beneath the sun. It is not the smell of a garden. It is the smell of an aftermath. They step out, one at a time, onto ground that is not quite solid yet. The earth gives a little beneath each foot, soft as wet ash, still holding the memory of the water that buried it. And they look around, and they begin to understand what they have survived into. There are no cities on the horizon, no columns of smoke rising from distant hearths, no voices on the wind, no movement of people on the far hills. The world they remember, the towns, the markets, the crowds, the noise of a living civilization, is simply not there anymore. It has been scrubbed entirely from the face of the earth, and what remains is wide and quiet and empty. There is a detail in the text, easy to pass over, that belongs to this moment. Before the door ever opened, Noah had sent out a dove, and it had returned carrying a freshly plucked olive leaf. We remember it as a gentle image, a symbol of peace on greeting cards and church windows. But stand inside the moment and feel what it actually meant. That single leaf was not a symbol. It was evidence. Evidence that somewhere out there, beneath the receding water, something green was beginning to grow again. It was the first fragile proof that the graveyard was not permanent, that the earth might once again be a place where living things could stand. It was not joy. It was the bare, trembling beginning of hope. And hope is a far harder thing than joy. So they stood there, the 8 of them, on the soft and silent ground, breathing the heavy air, looking out at a planet that was theirs now. In a way, no one had ever owned anything before. And the question pressing down on them was not a happy one. It was the most human question there is. What does a person feel standing in the place where an entire world used to be? The first thing they would have felt was the silence. And to understand that silence, you have to understand what the world had been before it. The world Noah remembered was loud. It was crowded. The pre-flood earth had been filling with people for many generations, long-lived people in vast numbers, building cities and cultures and a civilization dense enough that God looked upon it and saw that the whole of it had become corrupt. Whatever else that world was, it was full. Full of voices, full of faces, full of the ordinary noise a person stops hearing because it is simply always there. And now there was none of it. Step outside the ark with them and listen for what is missing. There are no voices but their own. No neighbor calling out, no child laughing in a distant yard, no merchant, no stranger, no crowd. The entire human race has been reduced to 8 people standing on a hillside, and beyond the sound of their own breathing, the planet has gone completely, utterly quiet. They are not alone in a single room. They are alone on an entire world. Consider one small thing, and let it carry the weight of the whole. That first night, when the cold came, one of them would have knelt and built a fire. And that single circle of light flickering on a dark and empty hillside was the only cooking fire burning on the entire surface of the earth. One fire. On the whole planet. One. Everywhere else, from horizon to horizon and around the curve of the world, there was darkness and water and silence, and not one other human soul awake to light a flame. The entire warmth of the human race could be held in a single ring of stones. That is a silence most of us will never have to imagine, but not all of us, because there is a particular silence that some people know, the silence of walking back into a house after the funeral is over and everyone has gone home. The rooms are the same. The furniture is where it always was. But the sound that made it a living place is gone, and what is left is a quiet so total it has a weight to it. A quiet that presses against your chest and tells you, without words, that the world you lived in is over and a different one has begun. Anyone who has stood in that kind of silence knows something of what those 8 people felt on that first empty evening. And then, as the silence settled, a second weight would have descended on them, heavier, in its way, than the grief, the weight of the task. Because these 8 people were not simply survivors. They were a beginning. They were, every one of them, the entire future of the human race. Stop and let the arithmetic of that sink in, because it is genuinely staggering. 8 people, 4 men and 4 women, and of those, really only 3 young couples capable of bearing the generations to come: Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the 3 women who had married into the only family left on earth. The text gives us these 8 names and leaves the rest to inference. But on this point, it is unambiguous. This was the family through whom the world would begin again. That was the complete inheritance of the human future. Every person who would ever live after the flood. Every nation, every tribe, every language, every face that would ever look up at the sky in every century that followed. All of it was contained, on that first morning, in 3 tents pitched on a muddy hillside. Think of any face you have ever seen. Every emperor and every beggar, every army that would ever march, every city that would ever rise, every song that would ever be sung in every tongue across the whole sweep of history still to come. On that morning, all of it was asleep in the bodies of a handful of frightened people who had just watched the world drown. The entire human story, narrowed down to the eye of a needle, and then asked to begin again. With nothing. No infrastructure, no cities to move into, no farms already planted, no tools beyond what they had carried onto the boat. The skilled hands of the old world had all been swept away. They would have to rebuild civilization itself from the bare ground up, knowing that if they failed, there was no one else, no backup, no reinforcements coming over the hill. The species lived or died on the strength of one family. There is a particular kind of weight that some people carry, the weight of knowing that everything depends on you and that you cannot put it down. The parent who realizes the survival of the children rests entirely on their own two shoulders, with no one else to share the load. The person who understands that if they fail, no one is coming to catch what falls. It is a weight that does not let you rest, because resting feels like abandoning the very thing you are responsible for. That is the weight those 8 people carried out of the ark. Not the weight of their own survival, which was hard enough, but the weight of everyone who would ever come after them. They were the thin and trembling thread on which the entire future of humanity now hung. But survival in this new world would prove harder than any of them could have known, because the world itself had changed. The rules had changed. And here the text tells us something specific and strange that we tend to read right past, something that turned the very nature of creation against them. In the world before the flood, human beings had been given the plants and the trees and their fruit for food. The original design, as the text presents it, was a world without the killing of animals for the table. A green world, a peaceable arrangement, where the creatures and the humans shared the same gentle provision. Whatever exactly that world had been, it was not a world built on the hunt. And then, stepping off the ark, that arrangement is rewritten. God speaks to Noah and his sons, and the words change the order of nature itself. Now, for the first time, humanity is permitted to eat meat. Every moving thing that lives is given to them for food, as the green plants once were. On its surface, this might sound like provision, a mercy, a new source of food in a barren world. But read what comes with it, because it is chilling. The same passage declares that from now on, the fear of you and the dread of you will fall upon every beast of the earth, and every bird of the sky, and everything that moves upon the ground. The fear and the dread. Sit with what that actually means. In whatever way the animals had related to human beings before, that relationship is now severed and replaced with terror. From this moment forward, the creatures of the earth will flee from the sight of a human being. They will run, they will hide, they will fight, because they have been made to be afraid. The peaceable world is gone. In its place is something harsh, a world of predator and prey, where to eat is to hunt, and to hunt is to kill, and where the other living things no longer trust the human hand, but flee from it in dread. Picture the first time one of them goes out to find food in this new order. They approach an animal as they always have, and the animal does not stand. It bolts. It runs from them as from a threat. Something that was once at peace with them is now terrified of them. The world they have been saved into is not a gentle one. It has teeth now. Survival in it will be violent, lonely, and hard, and the earth itself seems to have turned its face away from the people walking back out onto it. And it was not only the animals that turned hostile. The very sky, the seasons, the rhythm of the world itself seems to shift in the wake of the flood. And the text marks the change with a single, quiet promise that contains a hidden warning. After the waters recede, God makes a declaration about the future of the earth. As long as the earth endures, he says, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. We read it as a comforting promise of stability, and in one sense it is. But look closely at what is being promised. It speaks of cold and heat, of summer and winter, of the great swing of the seasons, the turning of the year from the freezing depths to the scorching heights and back again. Many who study these texts have wondered whether the world before the flood had known such things at all, or whether it had been a more stable, temperate place that did not swing so violently between extremes. We cannot be certain, But the language here points to a world now defined by those extremes, where the cold would come hard and the heat would come fierce, where the year itself would become a cycle of dramatic and sometimes dangerous change. And for the 8 people learning to live in it, that meant something very real. It meant the first winter. Imagine a family that may never have known a killing cold, suddenly facing it, the temperature falling night after night, the ground hardening, the wind cutting through whatever shelter they had built, and the dawning understanding that this cold could kill them if they were not ready for it. Imagine the first true summer in its turn, a heat that scorched the young crops and dried the streams, and tested whether anything they planted could survive to be harvested. Everything they thought they knew about how the world worked had to be relearned. When to plant and when the frost would come. How to store food against a winter they had never experienced. How to read a sky whose rules had changed. The environment was no longer a familiar home. It had become an adversary, indifferent and powerful. And they were 8 small people standing against the whole weight of it, with no one left alive who could teach them. And in the middle of all of this, the silence, the crushing burden, the hostile creatures, the brutal seasons, the text turns its attention to one man and records something we would rather it had left out. Because the very first thing Scripture tells us Noah did, once he had settled into this new world, was not a triumph, it was a collapse. The text says that Noah, the man of the soil, planted a vineyard. And when the grapes had grown and been pressed and fermented, he drank of the wine, and he became drunk, and he lay uncovered inside his tent. This is the man who walked with God, righteous enough to be chosen out of an entire corrupt generation, entrusted with the survival of every living thing. And here he is, in the first chapter of the new world, drunk and senseless in his tent. It is one of the most jarring turns in all of Scripture, and we must be careful with it. Because the text does not tell us why. It records what happened, plainly, without explanation, and it does not give us access to the inside of Noah's mind. We are not told what he was feeling, or what drove him to drink, until he could not stand. Anyone who claims to know for certain is reading into the silence. But the silence itself invites us to consider the man, and to consider what these eyes had seen, and what these ears had heard. For consider what he carried. This was a man who had lived through the end of the world, who had stood inside a sealed boat while, on the other side of those wooden walls, an entire human race was swallowed by the rising water. Whatever sounds reached him through the hull in those first terrible hours, he heard them. And then, for over a year, he floated on a silent sea above a drowned civilization, knowing everyone outside his family was gone, and that he had been spared while they were not. We have a name in our own age for the weight that settles on those who survive what others do not. To live through catastrophe is not to walk away clean, but to carry the memory of it, sometimes for the rest of one's life. The text does not diagnose Noah, and neither will we, but it shows us, with unflinching honesty, that the righteous survivor of the flood was not made whole by his survival. There is something here that anyone who has lived through real loss understands in their bones. Because there are people who got the very thing they begged for, who survived the illness, who made it through the disaster, who came out the other side of the thing they prayed to live through, and who then woke the next morning to discover that surviving was not the same as being saved. That being alive and being whole are 2 very different things. If you have ever stood in that place, you know something of the silence Noah woke into, alone in his tent, in the first days of a world he had been chosen to rebuild. What happened next, inside and around that tent, exposes the deepest and most sobering truth of the entire story. The flood had been sent for a reason. The earth had become filled with violence and corruption, and the waters had come to wash it all away. And standing on the far side of the flood, you might expect that the cleansing had worked, that the evil was gone, drowned with the old world, washed off the face of the earth forever. It had not. The incident in the tent makes that brutally clear. There, In the very first generation of the New World, something goes wrong between Noah and his son Ham. A violation, a dishonoring, the precise nature of which the text treats with deliberate reserve. And in its aftermath comes a curse, and a fracture in the family, and the first bitter division of the new humanity. The details are old and hard to fully reconstruct, but the meaning of the moment is unmistakable, and it lands like a stone. The corruption that the flood was sent to destroy did not stay at the bottom of the sea. It walked off the ark. It was here, already, in the first family of the cleansed world, surfacing almost before the ground was dry. And this is the thing the whole story has been quietly driving toward. The flood could wash the earth. It could not wash the human heart. The waters swept away the cities and the crowds and the whole corrupt civilization of the old world, but it could not reach the thing that had made that world corrupt, because that thing was not in the cities. It was in the people, and the people were on the boat. Evil did not drown in the flood. It survived, hidden in the safest place on earth, inside the ark, inside the hearts of the very family chosen to start again. The flood reset the board. It did not change the players. Humanity got a clean earth, a fresh and empty world, every chance to begin again from nothing. And it carried the old sickness right out into that clean world inside itself. And within a single generation, it was already breaking out. There is something here we are slow to learn and quick to forget. We keep believing that a clean slate will make us new, that if we could just escape our circumstances, start over somewhere fresh, leave the old life behind, then everything would finally be different. And again, we discover the same thing those survivors discovered, that wherever we go, we carry ourselves with us, and the new beginning is only ever as clean as the heart that walks into it. The Nephilim, the text hints, were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, but that is a shadow for another telling. What matters here is simpler and closer to home. The world was made new. The people were not. And so, we come back, at last, to the rainbow, to the image we began with, the soft and pretty symbol arcing over the fresh-washed world. But now we are ready to see what it actually is, because hidden inside it is the most important truth in the entire story, and it is not the truth we were taught. When God sets the rainbow in the sky as the sign of his promise, the Hebrew word used for that bow is the word keshet, and the keshet is not a gentle decorative thing, it is a weapon. It is the word for a warrior's bow, the bow of an archer, the instrument of war drawn back to loose an arrow at an enemy. That is the image the text deliberately reaches for, not a ribbon of color. A weapon of war laid against the clouds. And look at what is being done with it. The bow is hung in the sky, stretched across the heavens, and it is pointed away from the earth. The warrior has taken up his great bow, the bow that could and did unleash the destruction of an entire world, and he has hung it in the clouds with the ark turned upward, aimed away from the people below. It is the ancient gesture of a warrior laying down his weapon, the image of a god who has waged war against the corruption of the world with the most terrible weapon imaginable, and who now, looking at the 8 small survivors on the muddy hillside, hangs that weapon up and promises never to draw it against the whole earth again. And this changes everything about how we understand the survival of those 8 people. We tend to assume, somewhere deep down, that humanity made it through because humanity was worth saving, that Noah and his family earned their place on the ark, that the human race survived because, in the end, we were good enough to deserve a second chance. But the story we have just walked through dismantles that idea. We have seen the silence and the grief, the hostile world, the righteous man collapsing in his tent, and the old corruption walking off the ark to break out within a single generation. The survivors were not better than the world that drowned. They carried the same sickness in their own hearts. Humanity did not survive the flood because humanity had finally become good. Humanity survived because the warrior chose to hang up his bow. The new world was not a reward earned by the worthy. It was a gift held open by mercy, over the heads of people who had done nothing to deserve the room to begin again. The space to rebuild was not won, it was given. And here, at the end, the story stops being about them. Because if you have walked with these 8 people all the way through, this felt the silence, carried the weight, learned the hostile world, watched the righteous man break, and seen the bow hung up over a drowned planet. Then, somewhere along the way, you may have begun to recognize the shape of it. It is not only their story, it is the shape of the hardest seasons of every human life. There is a truth this account hands us, sharper and more honest than the comfort we usually reach for. It is not the gentle promise that everything will be all right. It is something harder and truer. It is the recognition that survival is not the same as restoration, that a person can live through the thing that ends their world and not get the old world back. The 8 who stepped off the ark did not receive their lost civilization, their drowned neighbors, their familiar earth. They received an empty hillside, a graveyard drying in the sun, and the unbearable task of building something new on top of everything they had lost. And if you are honest, you have stood on a hillside like that. Maybe you are standing on one now. Maybe it was a death, and not the grief everyone prepared you for, but the part no one mentions. The long months afterward, when the casseroles stop coming, and the calls stop, and you are simply alone in a house that is the same in every detail, except that the one sound that made it home is gone. And you understand that no amount of time is ever going to give that sound back. You did not die, you survived it, and surviving it did not return a single thing you lost. That is the shape of it. The marriage that ended and did not come back, the country you left and cannot return to. The version of yourself, or the life you had planned, that drowned in some flood of its own and left you standing in the silent after, with the old world gone and the strange new one not yet built. That is not a rare experience. It is, in some form, the experience of nearly every human being who lives long enough. The flood is not only ancient history. It is the shape of starting over when there is no going back. And notice what those survivors did, standing in their wreckage, because it is the same thing that carries anyone through. Before they built a single house, the text tells us, Noah built an altar, an act of worship and trust, raised on the bare ground, before anything else, a way of saying that even here, even now, even in the aftermath, the ground beneath him was held. And then they planted. They put seeds into the soil of a world that had just drowned everything and trusted that something would grow. An altar before a house, a seed in the ground of a graveyard. That is what it looks like to begin again when there is nothing left to begin with. But here is the deepest thing, the thing that fuses the whole story together. Those 8 did not rebuild their world because they were strong enough to deserve a new one. They rebuilt it because the space to rebuild was held open for them by a mercy that hung up its bow and turned its weapon away and gave them room they had not earned. And that same mercy is the shape of your own beginning again. You did not survive your flood because you were strong enough on your own. Somehow, against everything, the space was held open for you too. The bow that hung in the clouds over a drowned world is the same bow held over your own wreckage. The promise that the destruction is not the final word, and that there is room, still, to build. So let me leave you with the question this whole story has been asking from the beginning. Not what happened on that hillside 4,500 years ago, but what is the wreckage you are standing in right now? What is the flood you have survived without being restored? And knowing that the space to rebuild has been held open for you by something far greater and far kinder than your own strength. What will you build first? If this is the kind of honest, human return to the oldest stories in Scripture that you have been searching for, the kind that does not hand you a children's picture, but walks you into the real weight of it, then you belong here. Subscribe and follow the channel as we keep walking back into the deepest and most human mysteries of the Bible, one story at a time.